Welcome everyone, I'm Emily Haugen and I'm a student in the Emerging Media Department. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to welcome you all to this year's final Teach-In Tuesday. The theme for this spring session is disrupting pandemics, both biological like the coronavirus, but also societal like a systemic racism and other inequities of our world. We will begin today with an expert presentation, followed by interdisciplinary commentary. Today's presentation is by English professor Dr. Todd Lawrence, Earth, Environment, and Society professor Dr. Lorah, and art history professor Dr. Heather Shirey. The three launched the George Floyd and Anti-Racist Street Art Database on June 4th, after the death of George Floyd, taking notice of the art going up throughout the Twin Cities. Their talk today is titled Landscapes of Resistance, Street Art and Protests in the Aftermath of George Floyd's Murder. We'd like to note that today's presentation was recorded the morning of April 11th, a couple hours before Daunte Wright was killed, which is why it is not acknowledged in their presentation. After the talk, our first commentary will come from Dr. Paola Ehrmantraut from the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and director of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. The next commentator will be Dr. Kanishka Chowri from the English Department and director of the American Culture and Difference program. Finally, Dr. Olga Herrera from the English Department will speak.
Hi, I'm Heather Shirey. I'm a faculty member in art history and the co-director of the Urban Art Mapping Research Project. For the past year, our team has been working on systematically documenting street art globally, creating what Stuart Hall refers to as living archives, relating to the dual pandemics that are shaping the world we live in, COVID-19 and systemic racism.
Hi, I'm Todd Lawrence from the English Department and American Culture and Difference, and I'm one of the faculty directors of the Urban Art Mapping Project as well. Urban Art Mapping is an interdisciplinary, multiracial research team supported by the SOLVE initiative, and our collective backgrounds in cultural studies, geography, and art history shape the core methodology of the project. And in this slide, you can see various images of the team over the years. In the bottom right corner, you will see a picture of our most recent sort of iteration of the team.
Hi, I'm Paul Lorah. I'm a geographer in the Department of Earth, Environment, and Society. I'm working with Todd, Heather, and our student researchers to analyze the relationship between street art and place. One of our team's goals is to explore how place shapes art, and in turn, how art redefines and remakes urban space in ways that generate political dialogue, amplify marginalized voices, and hopefully promotes change.
So one of the questions to answer first off is why street art? And we think that street art is really important, that artists and writers producing work in the streets, which for this project includes graffiti, murals, stickers, wheat paste, posters, light projections, and more, that they create art of an ephemeral nature that reveals very immediate responses to events in the world in a manner that can be raw, direct, and fleeting. In the context of crisis, we argue that street art has the potential to reach a wide audience, transform urban space, and foster a sustained dialogue. Additionally, the role of art in the streets is particularly important at a time when museums and galleries are shuttered due to the pandemic. And in this slide, you can see some examples of pieces that are in the database. In a particular note, I want to highlight the bottom right piece by Zabu, which is in London. This is an example of a mural, the kind of art that is sanctioned and is probably not going away anytime soon. Compare it to the other two pieces, in particular, the pig face in the upper left-hand corner, which was documented at a BP station at University in Hamlin in St. Paul right after the uprising. And this is an example of the kind of art that is politically oppositional, aesthetically not as pleasing in the sort of mainstream kind of assessment, and art that will go away. And this piece in particular has already been covered over.
These are three pieces that were documented relatively recently in the last couple of weeks in some hot spots related to the murder of George Floyd. The piece on the left is near the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis, which was burned. And this is a piece by a known artistic group called Rogue Citizen. On the top right is a piece on barricades near the government center where the trial is currently taking place. Many different writers writing on this wall with chalk. And on the bottom is at George Floyd Square. This is a stencil that reads "Change is coming." We find that the work of many artists and writers who are producing works in the street expresses an understanding that we're living through a transformational historical moment. Artists and writers we've talked to convey disbelief and distrust, as well as hope and a vision for navigating new social norms. We think it's crucial that we document and analyze street art, not only because it's so ephemeral, but also because it captures the complexity of the experiences shaping the world today. One of our goals with this archive is to make the complexity visible now and in the future. So for that reason, we have 2 crowdsourced databases that we've created that allow us to analyze the themes that appear in specific locations and at specific moments in time. So we started about a year ago with the COVID-19 street art database, and then in early June, we added the anti-racist street art database as well. And we want to use these to understand how people are responding to these crises through street art at different locations at different times as well. So we can see, for example, in the piece on the bottom right, that even as early as April, some graffiti writers and artists were thinking about the intersections between over-policing and the COVID pandemic. The piece in the middle shows 2 stickers that are on the back of a sign documented in October that are also looking at the burning 3rd precinct, and it's next to a sticker that says wear a mask in Spanish. And then the piece at the top is one that relates specifically to COVID that went up in June in New York City, because we do also document work from places outside of the Twin Cities. So the George Floyd and Anti-Street Art database is the largest of the 2 projects that we have. We've so far had nearly 30,000 site visits to this particular site, viewers looking at it from over 153 different countries, and contributions that come to us from around the world. Most of the pieces, as I mentioned, are from the Twin Cities, but we have pieces from all over the world as well. There are approximately 1,900 works in this database right now, documented with metadata that includes the specific location and the date that the pieces were documented.
This is a screenshot of the database. Please visit it at George Floyd and Anti-Racist Street Art. And of the nearly 2,000 works documented in our database, most of those have addresses, and that allows us to map the location, the distribution, the extent of anti-racist street art. That's interesting because art's shaped by the context it's created in, and that's especially true for street art. Place acts like a canvas, and location shapes meaning. In the next slide, it'll show our study area, the Twin Cities, and in purple, the campuses of the University of St. Thomas. And we could download data from the Omeka database. And what you'll get is this next slide, where each red point depicts the location of a unique piece of art. And you can see that there's a geography here, that art's clustered in some places and not others. And that can be a source of interest for us. And the next slide will show you areas that are hotspots in the Twin Cities for art. And they're very different places. Next slide will show, for example, the location of the Government Center in the north and 38th in Chicago, where George Floyd was murdered, in the south. One of the things our team is interested in currently is, does the tone and nature of the art in those 2 places, very different places, change? With the Government Center being a nexus of control and 38th in Chicago being a nexus of resistance. Recently, we mapped sites of conflict. If you can go back 1 slide, Todd. We mapped sites of conflict after George Floyd's murder and found that the tone, the style, and the content of art appearing in neighborhoods where property damage and arson was concentrated was very different from street art located farther away. The next slide shows one thing that we're working on now, and this map depicts 2 variables at the same time. Darker colors tend to be areas where art is concentrated, and you can also see areas that are where art's concentrated that are African American. And the legend, that's the color in the top right, and areas where art is concentrated in areas that are more than 90% white. And from this map, we can pull other data layers. You can see in the next slide, for example, these are areas where we have art hotspots that are African American. You can put the points on top, and the next slide will show that you can just make lists of art that appears in those neighborhoods. We did the same in the next slide for white areas. And now that we have art in hotspots for white and Black neighborhoods, we can start to look at the difference between the 2.
So the next 2 slides I'm going to show you are a way of kind of thinking about how art can be different in neighborhoods that are different, that have different characteristics. This is the facade of Muddy Waters. This is in the Lynn Lake neighborhood and this is on Lyndale Avenue. This was documented on June 6th, and I'm going to show you a slide in a second about 2 weeks later. This is an example, we think, of a really interesting sort of rhetorical sophistication of writers speaking from one group into another, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways that this is done. On the left side, the first piece, you'll see this written message, crime about they targets, we been targets. So what you might notice first is that this message uses African American vernacular English, which suggests that it's spoken, that it's supposed to be understood as being a Black voice. It also is a Black voice that is speaking to a Black audience, but it is meant to be overheard, right? And it sort of exists in a neighborhood that is predominantly white. This is actually at the boundary where two different neighborhoods, one that has 30% Black population and one that is predominantly white. This is very close to Uptown for reference. So this is an example of signifying what we might call loud talking, right? Where the voice speaks to another insider, but the person who's being critiqued or spoken about is in the room and is meant to overhear this, right? And this message also turns on the use of this Greek trope antanaklesis, which is the repeated use of a word where the meaning is different in the second use of the word. So crime about they targets, referring to the Target store, right? Crime about they targets, we been targets, that is targeted, right? So this message critiques the tendency for this white audience to be concerned about property destruction as opposed to the destruction of Black BIPOC bodies, right? On the right side, you see a more direct message from what we can presume is a Black voice to a white audience. Your white tears will find no comfort here. And then below that, you've got these small wheat paste images, a bunch of them, which we'll see a larger version of in the next slide. So this is documented about 2 weeks later, and you can see that the facade has changed a little bit. The biggest change is on the left side. Crime about their targets is now gone, but it's replaced by this extraordinary image, which is no less confrontational, right? You've got this Black woman who is dressed very well, and she's got pearls and this beautiful dress, and she's standing in front of a lectern, I think, and you can see her name, Ms. Resist, is there. And she's actually, if you can see, drinking from a cup which says on it, white tears, right? An act of defiance, right? And an act of sort of resistance against the tendency for white folks to, again, privilege property and their own sort of pain at loss over the destruction of BIPOC bodies. Behind that, you see these Black fists with the middle finger extended, right? And on the other side, you can see that we have the same messages repeated. But together, again, this is a really great example of what we think is a really direct criticism or message to a white audience that's meant to be confrontational, right? So knowing where this exists helps us to read it in this particular way. So that's a really important aspect of that connects how you might read art with all the work that Paul is sort of showing us how to do and leading us on.
This particular example helped shape the work that we're doing in relationship to the George Floyd and Anti-Racist Street Art Database. This piece appeared on the Hook Fish and Chicken on Lake Street in July, just a little to the east of the piece that Todd just discussed, but in a neighborhood that would be identified as more than 30% Black. And as you can see, it reads, "Don't let them change the narrative," in scrolling spray painted graffiti alongside stenciled text with some of George Floyd's last words. Our work is really shaped by our recognition that BIPOC voices and experiences are severely underrepresented in archives. And this work of documenting voices and experiences has to be done with care without co-opting the narrative. The narrative of this moment, this movement, and this ongoing crisis is complex, and it's not going to be easily wrapped up with a neat bow. It's complicated, it's messy, and the wide variety of works in the archive help capture that. People have used walls to claim space, to tell their stories, to express their justified anger, to show their vision for the future. And our goal is to amplify these voices and experiences and make sure that these textual and visual messages are not simply erased. Next slide. Not surprisingly, there are many cases where we've been able to document early graffiti, for example, that's buffed over or painted over with a new message or an image that sometimes projects a new meaning over the course of time or amplifies the original message. An example would be a simple spray painted BLM that then becomes a large mural that says Black Lives Matter. Or this example at the Sherwin-Williams on Lake Street is, I think, really interesting. So here we can see the Sherwin-Williams as it appeared. This is the 500 block of Lake Street. This is how it looked on May 30th, just a few days after the murder of George Floyd. And you can see that it's covered with oppositional messages about the police. So graffiti done in lots of different writing with different colors of spray paint. So lots of different people coming along and adding on messages that are expressing oppositional attitudes towards the police. And then the next slide shows us how this changed over the course of time. So again, on the top left, that's the same image I just showed you from May 30th. And then these other images are from June 6th. And we can see that the owners of the building have had those earlier messages painted over. They've removed them. They've added the Sherwin-Williams paint logo over some of the messages, maybe changed the plywood out. And then the entire side of the building, this is the west side of the building, has been painted with a large mural that now has an American flag, a document perhaps referencing the constitutional or other foundational documents, and then text that says "Reform United in Love." So essentially this piece proposes that love and unification can solve the problem of systemic racism, and that this is indeed the American way emphasized by the flag and the document. But with this work, unification comes at the expense of removing and essentially erasing the multitude of confrontational and oppositional voices through the graffiti that are calling to abolish the police.
So our work is digital in nature, and that was intentional on our part when we began. But there are organizations in the Twin Cities that are actually preserving and collecting physical boards, and we've been really lucky and blessed to be working with one of them, which is Save the Boards to Memorialize the Movement. Kenda Zeldner-Smith and Lisa Kelly. Kenda is in the top left picture, and Lisa's in the middle of the bottom right picture, are the founders of that movement. And their work has been focused on preserving these boards for the communities in which those boards have existed in. And they have collected over 700 boards. And we've been working with them to help to digitize those boards and that will go into our database, but also to provide them for a digital presence as they work towards exhibiting some of the boards, about 200 boards in May. So this work is extremely important, as I said, for preserving the boards for the communities where the boards existed, in particular the Black and BIPOC community. But we feel like our work overlaps. And so we have, I think it's been a really productive partnership for us to work together, and it's really enriched both of our projects. And so we'll continue to do that into the future.
We think space is the context we operate in, providing us opportunities and constraints. And this project, we believe, demonstrates the power of art to reimagine, redefine, and remake place in a context of crisis. We do have the power to change ourselves by changing the city. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paola Ehrmantraut, and I'm a professor of Spanish at the Modern and Classical Language Department, and I am the director of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at St. Thomas. I want to thank you for this opportunity to participate in this teaching. After watching this great presentation by my dear colleagues, I am in awe of the work they have poured into this project and in the commitment shown by students. As a respondent, I will bring the perspective of my discipline, Latin American literature, to this conversation about this database, this amazing archive of street art that captures an anti-racist response to the killing of George Floyd last May. Archives are a strong cultural trope that can be found in some of the most important works of Latin American literature of the 20th and 21st century, from the infinite library of Jorge Luis Borges to the Máquina de la Memoria, or Machine of Memory, in 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, collections and archives abound. In these and many other works, people building or visiting archives signal a moment of crisis, a community looking for answers, usually in the aftermath of an authoritarian government. An archive is like a stubborn memory that knows it is threatened. Much like the archive you have presented us, with its urgency, its creativity, its unmistakable message. I see those elements in your work. Nobody can remember it all, like Ireneo Funes, the poor character in Borges' story, who is tormented by his all-powerful memory. Archives are our best option because total memory, literature warns us, is a curse. Memory must be imperfect, like the archives in Latin American novels and films. Imperfect and chaotic, archives like labyrinths built to lose ourselves in, partial documents, empty files, or a misleading index card. Not everything will be recorded, not all boards will be saved. Archives always generate questions about what makes it into a collection and what will fade away. It must be noted that, unlike this carefully cataloged database, the archive image in Latin American literature and film is purposely disorganized because it must question the principles of classification, order, and control that have been disobeyed since colonial times. After our last dictatorship in Argentina, where I'm from, the writer Ricardo Piglia, in his novel Respiración Artificial, Artificial Respiration, made of the archive a crime scene. In my post-dictatorship culture, the archive is a memory machine, no doubt. One that signals more than anything that we need to build it. We need to pay attention. It's a vantage point from which we will see what comes next. In societies where there's widespread recent historical trauma, archives are most necessary because their presence is healing. Listening to this presentation, I am excited to see a high density of red dots, representing many hands on so many walls that are signaling resistance and opposition to white supremacist violence and brutality rooted in racism. I focus on the dots that congregate along Lake Street, which is one of the areas where the new Latino diaspora has settled in our cities. After the fire and destruction of last summer, that iconic street is being rebuilt, and it is not clear what will happen to the culture that produced that voice outside institutions, outside the media, that unique and contestatory voice captured in the street art you are saving from time for us. Will the new Lake Street have room for those voices? It is truly an open question. That's why I am particularly grateful for your work, because this archive will be the window from which we will see and read those changes. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kanishka Chowri, and I teach in the English department and the program for American Culture and Difference. First of all, I want to thank Todd, Heather, and Paul, and the many students who have been participating in this project over the last couple of years for their work on the Ehrmantraut mapping project. Not only is the database and the findings a tremendous resource for scholars and activists, but more importantly, their work is an act of solidarity with the artists and the folks in our community who have been devastated by the murder of George Floyd and who will never be invited to a TV studio or have the benefit of an improved space from which to speak. Because of time limitations, I will address only one aspect of the presentation, which is the quotation from David Harvey about the right to the city, which concludes the presentation. Just as a reminder, Harvey's cited words are, and I quote, "The right to the city is far more than the individual right to access resources. It is the right to change ourselves by changing the city. The freedom to make and remake ourselves is one of the most precious, yet one of the most neglected of our human rights. Harvey's position is based on an understanding that urban restructuring takes place through a process of creative destruction. This, according to Harvey, nearly always has a class, and I would add a racial dimensions, since it is, and I quote Harvey again, usually the poor, the underprivileged, and those marginalized from political power that suffer first and foremost from this process. Violence is required to achieve the new urban world on the wreckage of the old, end quote. The street art discussed by the presenters then speaks not just the particular violent act that ended the life of George Floyd on that May evening, but also the systemic violence that erases lives and minimizes the suffering of the Twin Cities residents who have been displaced by the process of this creative destruction of gentrification and urban improvement projects that have been pursued with breathtaking intensity over the last several years in our cities. Most of us are familiar with the disturbing facts about racial inequities in our cities. Some of them bear repeating. Only 24% of Black households in the state own their home, compared with 77% of white Minnesota households. This is one of the highest disparities in the nation. And of course, we know the role of racial covenants that have played a place in creating these disparities in the first place. The median Black family in the Twin Cities area earns less than half of the median white family income. And then finally, the Black poverty rate in the Twin Cities area is 25.4%, which is over 4 times the white poverty rate of 5.9%. And these are only a few facts that I've selected. There are many more that point to the inequities of our cities. Street art speaks directly to these realities. As we see from some of the examples in the presentation, the following points are stressed by the artists. Policing is about protecting dominant property relations. Street art is about questioning those very relations. Urban empowerment and improvement is about the new brewery up the road, the new condo developments that are springing up all around us, and the third Starbucks on our city blocks. Street art is about reshaping this project of improvement and development so it has an actual impact on the quality of human lives and human relationships. Street art speaks of a community that has been subject to the looting of predatory financial institutions and the disruptions caused by debt and foreclosure. Street art reminds us that those in power have to be held accountable, that they cannot be allowed to change the narrative just because they have the means to do so. Street arts avow that it is the work of the people to frame the narrative so that it includes the voices of the dispossessed. Street art, in short, calls for a more democratic and inclusive vision of the city, one which all of us can inhabit with pride and dignity. I thank the research group, the artists, and the activists for sharing this possibility with us.
Hi, my name is Dr. Olga Herrera in the Department of English, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation today. I want to talk about murals and placemaking in Pilsen, which is a neighborhood in Chicago. And I want to think about how this tradition, in comparison to the presentation we saw in street art today in the Twin Cities, can help us to think about place and value, especially property value. I take as a point of departure something that Dr. Todd Lawrence said in the presentation, which was, in the context of crisis, we argue that street art has the potential to reach a wide audience, transform urban space, and foster a sustained dialogue. And when I heard him say this, it made me think of this mural tradition that I come from in Chicago. While it wasn't a response to a moment of crisis, it was part of the Chicano movement in the 1960s and 70s, which was part of the greater civil rights movement in thinking about the rights of people of color And this mural here, you can see it's about representation, especially in a public space in the city of Chicago. This mural was painted on the side of a viaduct, actually. So whenever I would take the bus from my neighborhood to the downtown, I would pass by this mural. And every time I saw it, it made me feel like, my culture was represented. The faces on this mural show a variety of different kinds of emotions or stances, possibly. But I think that thinking of Dr. Lawrence's quote, one of the things that stood out to me was the way that this street art, this public art has the potential to reach a wide audience. And, for me, it helped me be in dialogue with what, the values or what the message of this mural represented. In the presentation today, we also saw an example of the Sherwin-Williams building and how some street art had been painted on that building and how the company had come in and painted over it its own mural and projected its own message to the community about unification and patriotism, right? And so that made me think of an example from Pilsen. This is Casa Aztlan, which was a community center, also started in the 1970s. And this mural on the left was painted by Ray Patlan, a local artist, with some students. In 2013, the building was auctioned off by the bank because the organization was in debt and owed some money on the building. So in 2017, this mural, which had come to be an icon of the community, was painted over. The new owner, which was converting the building into individual units, so loft units, painted it over without consulting anyone in the community. And so the community then came back into conversation with him. And through this conversation, they were able to get him to offer to paint the mural again and to create a community arts organization for children. But what he wouldn't do was to say that he would convert any of these units to affordable housing units, which I think says something about, private property interests in conversation or in dialogue, or even in opposition to community interests. This is the face of the building again, repainted. We can see that here there are new faces that the community chose to represent a different moment, in the present in 2017. But this brings me back to the presentation that we just heard from Drs. Lawrence, Shirey, and Lorah. And because what happens in Pilsen is also very much a result of gentrification, that this owner was able to come in and develop this building for sale, to increase the value of that building beyond what any local community member could afford. That this example of Casa Aztlan, shows us that the law, isn't really designed to protect the community's interests here, which was to keep this emblem of ethnic pride or cultural heritage available, but rather to protect that of the property owners. And so it strikes me that the art that we saw today, that protest art is a fundamental act of resistance to the value our society places on the protection of property and property rights before community or individuals. And I really appreciate that about the presentation today, and I look forward to being in further conversation about it.